Good afternoon. It's Senate Institution. It's Tuesday, February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day. The start of the new week for the committee. And as I just do on Tuesdays, I'd like to just go around the table and introduce everybody. And starting over here.
Yes, good morning, Senator Mazza from Grand Isle Chittenden District.
Wendy Harrison from the Wyndham District. Green Renner, Chittenden North, including Fairfax.
And Brian Collmore, representing the Rutland District.
Linda Leon, Committee Assistant.
And Russ Ingles in the Essex District. And we have some guests with us today. What do we have?
Hardy Merrill, Deputy Commissioner of Finance and Management.
And Nick Kramer with the Department of Finance and Management.
Welcome to Senate Institutions. Would you like to start, sir?
Thank you. I'd love to take a seat. I think it might be, if I could set up another chair.
Whatever you'd like.
It might be helpful if we
Absolutely.
both address the committee together.
Absolutely.
So we are here today on the topic of the Capital Expenditure Cash Fund, which was created in 2022 Act 185, which was the FY23 appropriations bill. Section E106.1 actually creates the fund, and then section E106.2 requires an analysis and report to be provided by the Commissioner of Finance and Management to this committee, as well as to the House Institutions and the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. So I'm here today on behalf of the Commissioner of Finance and Management, who has the good fortune to be skiing in Colorado today. Otherwise he would be here along with Nick Kramer, who's our budget analyst, who specializes in the Treasurer's Office and debt service, and really did the the majority of the actual analysis work behind the report that we're going to present here today. I'll just add, the Capital Expenditure Cash Fund, the creation of the fund was part of the governor's recommended budget for FY23.
Did you send anything that we can put up on the screen, or are you just going to read from read what you have?
If I might, Mr. Chair, I think the committee has the document. I was noticing on the committee's website, it's actually listed under last Tuesday, February 7th, under Scott Baker. There's a cash fund report, which I will walk through in some detail.
Sorry to interrupt you guys. I apologize.
No, thanks.
Not at all, Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, I don't have my.
You said it was last Thursday?
Tuesday.
I believe
Last
Tuesday,
Tuesday,
February 7th.
February 7th.
I'll make copies and give it to you.
Thank you. If it's not, it's just this part.
It's
It looks like it's about 5 pages.
just this report. Yeah, I think it's 8 pages.
Okay.
Would you like me to display it?
Can you?
Sure.
Yeah, that would be great.
Great. Sorry we didn't.
No problem at all. Just really helpful for us to be able to follow along, especially about this subject matter.
Absolutely. So I was just going to say a few high-level words by way of introduction to the subject. The creation of the Capital Expenditure Cash Fund, was part of the governor's FY23 governor's recommended budget. However, I'll add it was by no means the sole invention of the governor's administration, nor a unilateral proposition. Former Treasurer Pierce has long been an advocate of such a structure, and we were pleased that it was it was able to make it to the finish line, at least in terms of the agreement that having a fund created for the purpose of being able to use general funds to reduce capital bonding and borrowing needs was something we all agreed on. What was not defined at the time of Act 185's passage was what the ongoing funding mechanism would be. So that's largely what we're tasked to recommend with our report to the committee. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Nick to really provide the nuts and bolts.
Anybody got any questions before we move on? Okay, there you go. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Deputy Commissioner. I think it's worth underscoring just the last thing Deputy Commissioner Merrill mentioned about the report, namely that though this is coming from the administration, this really, we can't, I think, claim entirely credit for all the ideas in this. Specifically, this iteration of the report that's on the screen behind me has really benefited from some input from Treasurer's Office staff, and Joint Fiscal Office. I know there was some flexibility in the delivery of this report this year that allowed us to kind of bring the brain trust together and work out some details related to debt service assumptions. So just want to thank the committee for their flexibility on that. And hopefully the end result that you see before you is a report that converges towards consensus more than, it might otherwise have been. So
Just real quick.
I'm sorry, that doesn't look like that. Is that,
So I believe there were 2 documents or maybe several shared
Yeah, this is
under
the
Scott
other one.
Baker, and this is the CDAC
This is
presentation,
the one.
I think,
Okay, gotcha.
Ours, there were 2 that day.
titled the Vermont's Capital Expenditure Cash Fund.
Yep.
Sure, yeah, so maybe I'll pause a second while that's getting loaded, I guess I can just continue to speak at a high level. I mean, I think, as the Deputy Commissioner mentioned, the idea behind the cash fund is fairly simple. It's out of Home Economics 101, right? If you can avoid putting money on your credit card, you stand to save potentially considerably on interest payments. And that, to the degree you can reallocate those savings from interest payments towards other expenditures and potentially defray more credit card usage, you create kind of this virtuous cycle where eventually, you're weaning yourself off debt. And of course, in this instance, the agent in question is the state of Vermont. The credit card is our general obligation debt service, which historically, though, of course, Senator Mazza and others will remember some exceptions. Historically, general obligation debt is how we fund our capital budget, right? So I think the idea, and it's important to situate this report and this recommendation in a larger context. As this committee knows, the state has been working to lower our level of debt of general obligation bond issuance over the last decade or so. And there's a number of really valid reasons for that, right? Having to do with our demographics and ratings from credit rating agencies. I think this committee heard from the Treasurer's Office pretty extensively last week about the CDAC recommendation. But I think one of the challenges of that trajectory that this committee will be no stranger to is, well, how, as you're lowering your overall bonding authorization, how do you do that without sacrificing necessary investments in capital expenditures, which we all know are multiple and ongoing. And I think Senator Mazza has pointed out some significant ones coming down the pipe. So this is really our attempt to answer that question. I think at a high level, what we're proposing is to not alter the bucket of capital investment, but to sort of fix that, that level of investment in statute, and then slowly over time, develop a mechanism that doesn't alter kind of gross jurisdiction in terms of investment, but only the percentage of our capital investments that are funded through debt versus the percentage that's funded up front. So we believe this is a mechanism that can do that.
So we started out at 25 million. And looks like we got like 20.9 million that we're looking to capitalize. It sounds like you're going to go through how we're going to fund this, which have been some proposals. I think it's been talked about a little bit. Is it the idea that maybe at some point in time that we wouldn't borrow any money at all in the capital budget, and this it would be cash, or is it that just that's not going to happen?
I would feel ill-equipped to speak on behalf of the administration in terms of the long-term goal. I think probably it's relatively unlikely, as members of this committee have commented, that we'll ever get to a point where there's no borrowing in the state. But I think to the degree that we can supplement what borrowing does happen with upfront cash fund usage, I think the administration would regard that as a success, right? And so to directly answer your question, Chair, I think I couldn't say for certain whether that's the goal, but it's certainly, if you look at the details of the proposal, and I'm happy to walk through those, that's not the scenario that we're steering towards. Only that over time, cash fund usage will grow, and that's meant to augment existing.
And I'm not trying to get you to say something. I understand, you can only say what you can say, but we expect at some point in time that the cash fund will be more than 25 million. Is that the idea that we're gonna try to grow this thing a little bit better?
Certainly, yeah, and I'd be happy to, I think maybe
Okay,
at
I'll
this
let
point
you-
it makes sense.
I'll let
to
you
move
go on to presentations. Yep, thank you.
No, thank you for those clarifying questions. So yeah, the 25 million that you're referencing is what this body put into the fund as sort of a seed last year. And I think it's also worth mentioning, so this is now, yeah, page 1 of the report. Another action that was taken was to make a $20 million appropriation to the treasurer's office for the purpose of calling early callable bonds. And the idea being that the savings from those bonds called early could trickle back into the fund and provide sort of a medium-term funding mechanism. But that, I mean, $20 million is a lot of money. Interest savings on $20 million of callable bonds is not in and of itself really a long-term funding proposal. So what we are proposing is, I think, a really simple construct. It takes a minute to explain, but we're essentially proposing that every year an annual benchmark calculation be made. And that's 4% of the last completed fiscal year's general fund appropriations be calculated. So I'm actually on page 2 of the report, you know, if it's helpful to follow along. And I'll talk in a second about where that 4% number comes from, but just to sort of flesh out the mechanism, we're saying every year, 4% of the last completed fiscal year's GF appropriations be calculated. The reason we chose last completed fiscal year is that those numbers are set in stone at the time of budget preparation. So last completed fiscal year for FY24 budget preparation is FY22. There's no BAA pending. There's no administrative adjustments. Those are numbers. The books are completely closed that everybody can agree on. So you calculate that 4% benchmark. Then you compare that to the current budget year general fund debt service obligations. And that's a calculation that happens every year anyways, as in consultation with the Treasurer's Office and Department of Finance and Management. That's what informs the B1000 section of the big bill, is just our debt service line. So we take that number, which we calculate every year anyways, compare it to that 4% benchmark, and any difference between those two numbers gets automatically swept into the cash fund. And so that's the basic proposal. And I think probably rightly so, the first question is, okay, well, what is that 4%? Where does that number come from? And that was a pretty strategically chosen figure to track to historically what the general fund budget, the operating budget has been paying anyways in debt service. If you look at, I think, FY17 through FY22, the average, and you can calculate the total general fund appropriations made in that budget year. And then you look at, as a percentage of that total, what have we been spending on debt service? And it's been about 4 to 5%. The average, I think, between those FY17 and FY22 was something like 4.22%. So we've been spending more than 4% on debt service anyways. And I'll note, because I know, and I'm happy to talk in more detail later to some of the reservations that have been surfaced about the politics of the building and committee jurisdiction. But that 4% is kind of a non-negotiable number that the appropriations committees, for instance, just fork up every year anyways. We don't not pay our debt service obligations. So that has sort of automatically been included as part of the budget. So what we are proposing, as I mentioned at the outset, state is on a trajectory of lowering its debt authorization over time. So though the average has been above 4% for the last 5 years or so, we're actually at a point where it's projected to go below 4% slightly, high 3% as a percentage of overall general fund. So what our mechanism is trying to do is capitalize on that. If we're paying, in fact, less than 4%, let's collectively and in statute lock in 4% of the budget as kind of going to the capital bill, if you will, and bank those savings of whatever the decline in debt service is over time, and that will trickle into the cash fund, again, in turn allowing for more cash fund use, which presumably, if that's used to offset borrowing, it's that virtuous cycle again, whereby.
Yeah, could I, now, this would have to clear your appropriations committee, is that correct?
This iteration of that, yes.
Because we've got so much surplus, not surplus, but federal money in the last couple of years. We've had a very robust budget. Do you see them buying onto this proposal? Because one of the places they're gonna have a demand bigger than ever in appropriations the next years, if I understand what's coming down the line here for programs. So you think they'd be glad to tie it to something with an obligation? Because the first place they'll take it is from here, because they assume that they'll need the money over there. So that's my question.
So I certainly appreciate the question, Senator. I think, and obviously I can't speak on behalf of the appropriations committees. I think the point that we're really hoping to drive home, and we're scheduled to have conversations with both appropriations committees about this, is that, like I said, we've been paying about this amount anyways in debt service. A point I was about to make, which I think is really important and really worth underscoring, is if this entire proposal is disregarded and we kind of continue in the business as usual scenario and roll all of these proposed cash fund uses that we lay out in this report into our general obligation bond issuance, the amount of debt service as a percentage of our overall general fund appropriations is projected to stay around between 3.5 and 4% anyways. So from the appropriations committee standpoint, I would assume the decision is really, do you lock into this kind of mathematically unambiguous 4% calculation?
Leave it open that they can do what they want.
And it may be that in a given year, there are some savings from their perspective, that it's 3.7% or whatever. But I will say, over the course of 20 years, I mean, the difference is about $150 million in interest payments that ultimately taxpayers are responsible for, right? And so, or about $7 million a year in interest, if you want to divide out by the years, the difference between the pre-funding cash fund proposal and sort of the business as usual scenario.
I've been here when there's been a big battle of what to put in the big bill, what to put in this bill, because there's always a place they can come for money. It's usually here, because this is a place where we have the ability to bond. So I would be surprised if they accept this, but I don't know, maybe because they've been doing it, but they've always liked that flexibility of not coming over here to take some money that they're going to be short of on their side. We haven't had this battle for quite a few years. There used to be a time when they tried to put the labor cost over here, and the labor cost went there on projects and buildings.
Good, point on that, mention that the other change that happened along with creating the capital expenditure cash fund was in the governor's recommended budget, which did see through to the bill as enacted, the engineering costs, for instance, a few $1 million within buildings and general service, which had been paid with, somewhat absurd notion of paying not only the wages of permanent classified employees, but even the retirement contributions. To be putting that on the credit card, right? And so that was another part of, the strategy that was put forth, and so that is done. That's been, so that's already,
Architect design.
so that's already a few million, off the top. That's moved, now housed in the regular general fund budget, and won't be drawing on bonded debt. But we're hoping to get the ball rolling. That will actually develop some momentum to create less and less each year. And again, to Nick's point, we've been having, I guess, a hard time really getting this across. But I hope we'll be more successful, which is you're going to be forced to pay the debt service anyway out of your appropriations bill if you bond rather than take the structure that's being proposed. So it's not it's not exactly a case of hanging on to money that you'll have to use as you want. Well, you're gonna pay it in debt service, and so we're trying to match a similar amount to what's been paid in debt service and calculate that amount, then pay the debt service. That will still be in the appropriations bill, right? It's about 75 million, currently. And that will still be paid first in the appropriations bill, but it's that whatever's left between 4% and that amount that kicks over, that's transferred to the capital expenditure cash fund to then reduce the amount of bonding. And if you keep doing that, it will keep going down.
We've had some good times and bad times, and, you know, right now, we've gone through this last couple of years with $1 billion from the government. It's gonna dry up, and the obligations are gonna be big, 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 because if we're talking about daycare, childcare, we're talking about sick leave, we're talking about all these big programs, there's gonna be some tough times coming.
Well, I don't disagree, but first off, I'll let Nick speak more to this, but I believe the formula is calculating based on general fund appropriations only. So it's, and so you can, to be sure, the general fund, I mean, general funds, which are not coming from the federal government, but they've certainly does, you know, particularly personal and corporate income taxes have been robust due to federal dollars circulating through, but we're not exactly, you know, the federal funds don't perhaps have as much of an impact as you fear. However, what you will have, which, you know, we can certainly recognize that we are having a swing with very high general fund.
But the federal funds backed up a lot of the other funds, so they use that money for other
But
things.
would you like to speak to the pendulum effect?
Yeah, one of the, I just want to add, I mean, just a thought process out there, and you're going to get there, I'm sure, but as Senator Mazza said, I mean, last year we battled hard to get this fund, and we, you know, it was a new idea, and quite frankly, to be fair, I'm surprised we got it through. Glad we did. I mean, when you speak to cooler heads that prevail, it makes sense. My question is you being the true numbers guys, when is it a no-brainer for everybody to say, okay, here's the success of this program? Where is, okay, you guys believed us and now we can show you. And I mean, I can see it now, but when is it a no-brainer for somebody else to jump onto this and say, no, we got to continue that? When do you see the big things happening?
Well, I think if I can say this, I mean, I think at this, we feel this is a no-brainer at this
Right.
point, right?
I get
And
that, yeah.
it may be helpful if I walk through some of the actual numbers of how we're projecting this might shake out. But I mean, over the course, this would be on page, well, I'm sort of dancing around, I guess.
It's
but-
okay, we can go wherever you want us to
But
go.
before you jump in, I just wanted to say high level. I mean, we certainly face times of an uncertain economic future.
Mhm.
And I would add that, you know, the cost of bonded debt could certainly be one of the uncertain variables.
Well, especially because the rates are going up, right?
And
So
so,
now your debt service, what we gotta pay back over the 20 years and 20 years and 20 years, as we keep moving ahead, is gonna be even greater than what you're even asking, the 4%, for sure.
so that time when is it really compelling might be sooner, you know, rather than later.
Right.
And of course, if I could tell you exactly when that time will be and what the magnitude of those changes will be, I would be doing something else probably for a living. But
Right.
Yeah, thank you. So the 25 million that we did last year, was that based on that 4% number, or did that just sort of come out of nowhere?
I believe that was just waterfall language based on variables.
it was based on, revenue coming in ahead of forecast. And that was, you know, it was contingent appropriation made in the big bill, which is if we end up with extra revenue at the close of the fiscal year, it can go to these different purposes, this being one of them. So.
I know we got hold of it late last year,
Yeah.
committee, we got hold of it late last year, and the people over here, Senator Mazza, myself, and Joe Benning. And, I mean, I know that we were the big drivers of it too, and we spoke with appropriations and all of that, and they said, hey, we'll give that a shot.
And I don't know whether this talks to your concern, Senator Mazza, but if the GO bond number exceeds the 4%, there's no transfer anyway, right?
Right, and I'm.
So that's kind of a relief valve in my way of, probably a poor analogy.
No, I think that's a great point, Senator, and to Senator Mazza's concerns about the hard times ahead, I think that it's important to underscore that $25 million appropriation is actually really helpful in that context. And what we're proposing is not to spend that all at once, but that really provides kind of a robust foundation, a robust fund balance and cushion for this fund. And so this transfer mechanism that we're proposing sits on top of that. And the idea being that you don't just spend in any given year what's available from this transfer, but that you can be really strategic about how you grow fund use over time, so that if there is a down year or several down years, that fund balance can be dipped into to kind of carry this idea through. And I think the one other point I just wanted to make on the previous comments about whether this is the timing of this and when is this a no-brainer. I think this committee heard extensively from Scott Baker last week about CDAC and the rating agencies. I mean, if you look and read the rating agencies' statements on the state of Vermont, one of our consistently biggest factors in that is our demographic profile, right? And that's this macroeconomic factor largely out of the control of anything we're doing in this room right now. I think one of the best ways that we can tell from our office and in consultation with the Treasurer's office to offset that is to be really intentional about, okay, given our declining tax base and workforce, how much we are issuing in general obligation bonds as a state. And if you look at the metrics that the rating agencies use to determine creditworthiness, a lot of them are exactly tied to that number. You know, bonds issued per capita, or debt per capita, or debt as a percentage of overall expenditure. So this proposal, we feel like, really sits well in that, again, ongoing effort to kind of bring us down to a more fiscally prudent space in the issue.
That reminded us in previous conversations that we had last week, and I just can't remember. I'm just trying to remember. Did the bonding companies, when they were working on the CDAC, when they were working on the 108 million, did they specifically mention the cash fund as far as that they liked that idea and that helped with their decision making as far as what our bond rating was?
I wouldn't want to speak authoritatively on it because I'm not familiar intimately with all three reports. I don't believe it was a major highlight. There was a lot going on during the last session that had more of an impact, like the investments in the pension systems and some of our restructuring and our pre-funding of OPEB. I think those surfaced more as highlights from all conversations and all indications we have in conversation with the Treasurer's office and rating agencies. This would be a credit positive development. And I don't know, since aside from setting up the fund and making that one-time appropriation into it, not much was done with it last year. I don't know how much it figured into their calculations.
I think once there's actually, an established,
Back
it's
to what
a real thing with an established mechanism.
Back to the question I said
it'll take
before,
the
as
note.
far as when does it come out where it's a no-brainer, where we can put something on it? I mean, because as a committee, we need to understand it better. And I apologize for the questions, but the questions that I have, but also I want to help my committee as a new committee. Sometimes we talk about in here, hey, this is the money that we have some stuff kicking around, you got to go fight for it. Sometimes you have to fight for it and you have to be able to ask the questions and tell the questions. And so that's why we get to these questions.
I guess what I would offer, at least, I think from our perspective, is when would this really be noticeable? Agencies like the rating agencies, is, in the capital bill, which I know you're familiar with, we're proposing not only sort of like the pre-construction costs and things out of the capital expenditure cash fund, but we're also proposing that large $62 million transfer and spending that out of the cash fund as well as part of the capital bill. And back to Nick's point, if you were to consider just doing bonded debt on that entire amount, that would be a significantly different number than the proposal being put forth, the combination of cash and debt. And I think this would be a noticeable thing, next year if this is how it crosses the finish line.
So back to the 4% and the formula that you're using, how else can you explain to us about how some of these monies are gonna filter into this cash fund?
If it's pleases the committee, I think it might be helpful to walk through the actual numbers, the actual calculations, say for FY24. So I'm on the middle of page 2 now in the report. And you can see in bold is sort of the generalized description of the mechanism, and then non-bolded below, the specifics are given for FY24. So like I said, you take the last completed fiscal year's total general fund appropriations, which in the current situation is FY22. That number is $2,333,000,000 and so on. 4% of that total is $93 million, more or less. Then the anticipated general fund debt service for the current budget year, based on all of the state's portfolio of issued bonds, is $75 million, 75.3 million. So you subtract kind of line 2 from line 1, 75.3 from 93.3, and you come out with a difference of about $17.9 million, which is about 18. And I think it's important to highlight that's a little bit of an outlier this year. The transfers wouldn't necessarily be that large right off the outset. Part of what, as Senator Mazza points out, the FY22 general fund appropriations were swollen by a huge influx of federal funds, right? Even though this is not directly using federal funds to calculate, but they inflated the balloon, so to speak. So this is a little bit of an anomalously large transfer in the current fiscal year. If you flip to the next page, you can see in the table at the bottom of the page kind of gives the long term over the next 20 years proposed, based on current debt service projections, what the transfers might look like. So if you look at sort of the middle column, which says CECF funding transfer, you can see that 17.957 million in the top row below the gray box. That's the number I just walked through calculating for FY24. But for instance, in FY25, based on our current assumptions, we would only be transferring about 5.8. But then you can see it sort of climbs back up. It's 14.3, then back down slightly to 13.8. And this all is based on a number of assumptions, many of which are likely to change. But I think this reflects kind of our best estimate of how this might go. And so you can see then in the column to the right, the proposed uses column, that's, like I mentioned, that difference between, rather than saying, okay, we're just going to spend in any given year what's coming into the fund, there's a more linear kind of growth of cash fund use proposed. The current governor's recommended capital budget, as this committee well knows, proposes using $8.3 million in FY24 and 10.85 in FY25. So that's kind of our current cycle, what we're proposing. We penciled in, based on this transfer mechanism, we could be using as much as $14 million in cash fund the next 2 fiscal years out, and then up to 18, 22, 26. I mean, I think it's important to point out that kind of progressing through time, and again, with the caveat that all these assumptions are subject to change based on major economic fluctuations, but based on sort of our best guess at the moment, by FY42, you could be using about $45 or $50 million worth of cash fund every year, which I think gets to your point, Chair Ingles, about will we ever replace general obligation debt? Well, maybe not. I think that's a decision for this legislative body and others, but we could be augmenting it by $50 million in a given year. I mean, that's approaching the current CDAC authorization, right, which this year is $54 million. So this could be a really substantive way to fund capital expenses in the state moving forward. And I think it's also important to contextualize that, if you look at the broad slate of states across the union, not by any means do all of them fund their capital projects through borrowing. Vermont is one. Right. There are many others that do. There are some that never bond for anything, right? So there's a huge diversity of opinion about what the best way to fund capital projects is.
We'll hold to it in 2042.
I'll be long gone, but you'll be here. You'll be here. You might be stuck in the corner like Roy Rogers' trigger, but you'll be here. Okay. So,
Speaking of the borrowing, I know you assume a 5% interest rate. How close are we right now, and how much could that affect things if the interest rate really goes up and down? And
so I wouldn't be equipped to speak. I think the treasurer's office would really be the best for people to speak to the current rate. I mean, in terms of the question of how much it would impact, this is just an educated guess. I mean, I think bond interest rates are subject to less volatility, right, than some other interest markets. I think that's to our benefit here. The answer is it could. Certainly any change in any of the assumptions behind this could shift. We have tried to be I think, fairly conservative in the estimates we made. For instance, and I draw the committee's attention to the general fund appropriations column. That's the far leftmost column in the
Yeah.
chart. That's assuming just a 2.25%
Okay.
annual general fund growth, which in actuality, and it's in the text above somewhere,
I could see it.
but in the last 10 years, the general fund growth was actually much above that, it was in the 4% range. So I think which begs the question, and certainly some have asked, well, why choose such a conservatively low number, 2.25%? I think the answer is multiple fold. One, we are entering into uncertain economic times. If you listen to the state economists, nobody knows where we're going to go. We're coming out of a significant influx of federal funding. And I think this is designed to be kind of a very cautious scenario to hedge against those potential
Makes sense.
downturns. So we feel reasonably confident, barring anything can happen, right? Acts of God, so to speak. But I think we feel relatively confident that this transfer mechanism, if it gets across the finish line, will be a really robust mechanism to populate the fund over time. There will be sufficient balance. Yeah.
Right, so-
Yeah, I think it sounds like a good idea, and it makes sense to equalize the hit through years too. So if you have that 4% goal, then you don't have capital debt or the general fund having to have very different highs and lows of what it's funding. That's helpful.
I think we're certainly hoping that the appropriations committees see it that way. I mean, I think this proposal, from our point of view, introduces a level of stability and predictability
Right.
to their budgeting process. That, like I said many times, inevitably some amount of money is going over to the capital bill from the operating budget anyways. This locks it in. It, we hope, ceases to even be a thought, right? We're proposing at the end of the report statutory amendments that would codify this transfer into law, and this would just happen. So
And I'm just looking at this now, but I would suggest that there be a check-in like 5 years after this was in progress. But why do you let the fund balance of the cash fund decrease so much? I would have thought that you would have some number that would be a target that you wouldn't want it to go below.
So that's, I think, a great point. And certainly in the multiple iterations of this report, I ran different scenarios, one that maintains a fund balance. I think ultimately what we were trying to balance is that there's nothing particularly sacred about carrying a fund balance. From your average taxpayer's perspective, well, why is the state sitting on all this money when they could be investing in capital projects?
Right.
So I think we felt like we didn't want to just keep a $25 million fund balance for the sake of it. I think the idea being, if you look at the potential transfers over time, that as those grow larger,
Yeah.
even if there's a little bit of a swing in 1 year, say I'm looking at FY40, say it's not $44 million that's transferred, but it's only 40 million or 38. That given the magnitude of the transfers, that there's sort of inherently more cushion available to buffer uses. And you'll see that the proposed uses.
Yeah, big difference between saving $5 million a year in debt service and saving $50 million a year. Once you get to those, in those out years,
Yeah.
that amount is so large that if even if you have a down year, it's going to come back next year because that annual amount, the difference between the debt service and the 4% has now grown so large that you'll make it back up next year.
Right.
Whereas right now it's like tiny, little bits that we need to seed it, so we need to be more conservative sooner to have a balance. But then once that gap is so huge,
There's really no reason to carry that balance.
they put that money to, if that's when you say put that money to work, for Vermont then.
I think to your point, Senator, I mean, FY42 is a long way away. This is really designed to be a roadmap and a starting point, and ultimately the decisions will have to. Yeah, exactly. Whether
Right, and like at the 5-year checkup, you would look at it and say,
Yeah.
it's like, what's the overall long-term goal?
Yeah,
And
what's it done for us, right?
Yeah, and then just in general, does the state have reserve funds? The state must have reserve funds, right?
We do, yeah, so we modeled this proposal in some ways after, there's a general fund stabilization reserve and a transportation fund stabilization reserve. And they're slightly different, but they also, that's a 5% max amount that can be transferred into that. So it's a similar construct where every year, depending on the total general fund appropriations in a given year, some amount can be transferred to a reserve fund. This, in terms of the purpose of the fund, we feel is distinct. Those are really rainy day funds, I think, designed to hedge against downturns and draws directly on these funds. This is, the capital expenditure cash fund, which we're really identifying for the specific purpose of funding capital projects. So a little bit more of a type.
So those are the only two reserve funds.
Well, no, there are a number of reserve
I
funds.
thought there would be more. Okay.
There are a number of reserve funds. Nick was just referring to the budget stabilization reserve and how the transfers into that reserve are made, which is, it can never exceed 5% of prior year's appropriations and amounts made to make it up to that amount. We followed similar sort of technical process in determining this as to that reserve, but I didn't come prepared to testify
No, that's
on
okay.
our reserve
It's
funds. We've got the human
Thought there
caseload
must be
reserve,
lots of
and
reserve
we've got
funds.
the balance.
Yeah, okay.
The balance reserve and the budget stabilization reserve are the two most prominent. Then there are a
Okay.
number of specific reserves for specific purposes like human services caseload and so forth.
Okay.
And we've been, the state's been maintaining, very healthy reserves to their statutory amounts. Not been in good shape there as far as our, bonding is concerned.
Great, thanks.
What else?
If there's no other questions from the committee on the table and the proposed use schedule, I think at your leisure, I would be thrilled if this gets some spare time if folks want to move in more detail. I'll just quickly run through the rest of the report. The different section numbers and some cost benefit analysis on the next page. These are all responding directly to what was in session law last year. As the Deputy Commissioner mentioned at the outset, this report was mandated by Act 185, Section E 106.2. So in that language, it was requested that the Department of Finance and Management, among other things, conduct a cost benefit analysis of dedicating these funds to this purpose versus other, I don't want to get the language wrong, other identified unfunded state fiscal pressures. So that language, I think, was perhaps intentionally broad. The unfunded state fiscal pressures are many. We have lots. We deferred to, there's an unfunded pressures report that Finance and Management is obligated to submit as part of the operating budget every year, which lists out some specific pressures. They're enumerated in italics at the bottom of page 4. And then on the top of page 5, there's some text just addressing those. And I think what we found is, that's I think a very valid question, right? If you're going to devote a certain amount of funds to this proposal, are there other places that they could be better spent? I mean, unfortunately, that's sort of the central question of government, right? It's this body. So that question we felt could potentially be a very broad one to answer. I mean, how do you look at the return on investment in something like housing or childcare or welfare programs? This could become quickly a pretty encyclopedic report if we did a really detailed analysis. And in some cases, we're in fact lacking information. So what we do is just compare and say, compared to the pension liabilities, which are an area in which a lot of activity has happened recently, and we feel like are certainly on a track towards betterment. We feel, the administration feels pretty strongly that this is a really good use of these funds, and that it's a very concrete, identifiable pressure. This is an external obligation to bondholders that we have to pay one way or the other, and we can calculate and know ahead of time exactly the interest savings incurred. So I think that's in a nutshell kind of what that section says. And I'm happy to answer any specific questions, but
No, I think it's pretty self-explanatory unless you guys have any questions about it. I like this right here, that just it tells about, it's really just kind of simple compounding on what the power of money can do. But the fact that it saves over $200 million in the next 20 years is just powerful stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's not small numbers we're talking about, right? In this context, and I think we're hopeful that if this moves forward, that this could really ultimately save Vermont taxpayers a lot. And so in the final section, if it works for the committee, I'll just run through, is the report, the language in the big bill requested actual statutory amendments that we would suggest. So those are on the last page of the report, the last two really, and I'll just walk the committee through. There's sort of a couple small ones and one big one. The big one is really in 1001B, Capital Expenditure Cash Fund, section B1A, and it's that big block of underlined text. And that's the language that codifies the 4% transfer mechanism. So I won't read it word for word, but I essentially exactly what I described, that you take 4% of the last completed fiscal year appropriations, subtract the current general fund obligation, general fund back general obligation debt service, and then make a transfer. And then the next, and then the end of that paragraph, there is an important sentence I'd highlight, which is if the amount of general fund back general obligation debt service exceeds 4% of the last completed fiscal year's general fund appropriations, no transfer shall be made. So that's that safety net, saying if the general fund is way down in a given year or debt service is way up, we're never going to be in a situation where the cash fund will owe the general fund money. We wanted to be really clear about that. So then in section C below, there's a slight amendment, which actually is sort of a linguistically slight change, but I think significant. You know, this sits, we believe, within the capital budgeting process. The governor has submitted now 2 years in a row his recommended capital budget, including proposed cash fund uses. So we are viewing the determination of the use of the cash fund as falling into the jurisdiction of the capital committees of jurisdiction. And so the way statute currently reads, it's as part of the operating budget, and we're proposing to amend that to capital budget, which would give this committee the jurisdiction to actually make the capital expenditure cash fund appropriations. The transfer, which is codified in statute before, would happen as part of the operating budget, but then the actual expenditures from the fund would be part of the capital bill. And we think that that makes sense. And obviously that raises the concerns, and that's the essence of the debate right now about this, is that issue of jurisdiction, but there it is in language. And then the last couple pieces, there's on the last page, number 3, there's a strike of, I really characterize these as just technical correction. These came directly from the treasurer's office. I think this expands the universe of bonds that they're able to use the cash fund to call. The original language kind of spelled out, you know, this early redemption of general obligation bonds. The treasurer's office said, hey, can we just strike these words? This sort of makes it easier from an administrative standpoint on their end. If the committee has questions about that, I'd really urge them to reach out to the treasurer's office. And the last thing is striking the entirety of section E. Current statute, as it was established last year, has this provision that if expenditures are made from the fund to basically to call bonds early, then savings from those early calls will trickle back into the fund. And the reason we're proposing to strike that is because that's actually accomplished through this 4% transfer. If you call bonds early, that lowers your debt service amount, and then that difference expands. And this creates kind of an administrative nightmare, or at least a task. You have to track every time you call a bond. You have to maintain the hypothetical debt service schedule and calculate every year what you would have been paying in interest. And if you start doing that a lot, then those pile up, and there's this sort of really burdensome task. So we feel like this proposal is a little bit more simple, elegant, direct, and achieves the same result.
You like simple.
I think so do we.
Committee, any questions? Yes.
Just one question. There's that but for language that we use when there's something that we're supposed to fund, but we don't. Would this be in the same category as that? And the one I know of is the housing one. Maybe there's others.
Talking about the notwithstanding.
Oh, I'm sorry, the
Notwithstanding, right.
notwithstanding, the but
Right.
for something else, yes,
Right.
yeah, the notwithstanding, would this be subject to that?
I believe any piece of legislation is subject to notwithstanding language. That's
Okay.
basically what notwithstanding language does, is say, this law is on the books, but actually this year we want to do this.
Yes.
And that's the challenge, right? And
Sure,
it's,
you can change it.
Yeah.
They do it.
it's been pointed out by, Representative Emmons and others, this is the body that writes the laws, right? So the laws can be changed. I think our hope, the only thing I will say on that is I think our hope is that by codifying this in statute, requiring notwithstanding language does raise the bar for if, say, a future appropriations committee wanted to notwithstand this provision and alter the transfer, that would have to be approved by both appropriations committees and ultimately the General Assembly as a whole. So there's a number of conventions that currently govern the way the state does its capital borrowing. For instance, this body has never chosen to exceed the CDAC recommendation, whatever they say. There's just sort of this convention that that's all
Well, they could.
they
Right,
could.
that's what we've heard,
right.
yeah.
I think our hope is that this would fall somewhere in the nexus of things that, yes, it's entirely possible, but I think we're hoping to raise that bar. If this proposal gets across the finish line, then it would be difficult to do that.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a process question. Who submits this language for change? Is that something this
So
committee or?
we have done that
Already
as
done.
part of the governor's recommended appropriations bill. So this is really just to ensure that our report asking for recommended language we have that aligning with the governor's recommended budget. So no action on anyone's part.
And you are, the governor's office will carry the fight to continue the cash fund. I think that's kind of the question I wanted to ask as well. Is so, that's not gonna be us doing no appropriations. That's you guys are going in there and gonna do the battle and get this, and try to keep this on track the way that you are explaining it to us.
I believe our intention is to have conversations with them. I would let parties speak.
Might be helpful if we could offer the information that
Oh, we're definitely gonna
Relative
go after it as well. for
relative
sure.
committee support, but we're
Yeah.
planning on carrying the flag on this. We
Yeah.
see it as our challenge.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm hoping, to make more headway. We struggled, I think, with Nick and Commissioner Gresham presented to your House counterparts. Some of what I think is understood within this committee about how the mechanism works. I don't think it had fully sunk in. I think there was some misunderstanding around whether the committee bill, the capital bill committees of jurisdiction would actually have control over the appropriations, which is what we are, the structure that we're designing. Yes, it would rely on a transfer, but that transfer is set in statute. That's not just a one-off thing. Appropriations has to agree on each year. I'll add, there is the one-off, which is unusual, the 62 million.
Right.
We probably don't have time to get into that. I'm prepared to explain more, why we thought it made sense to propose it this way as a transfer to the capital bill. And the short story is some of these projects, already have bonded dollars appropriated and we're adding. And they're projects that have traditionally been funded by the capital bill and the matching funds for drinking water, clean water. So, we thought it made sense to stay here, but that's, we wish us well in our
We do.
efforts, so.
Your success is our success, and that's the thing we talk about in this committee all the time, especially the 62 million that's sitting out there pretty naked. When you have a committee someplace else that wants to steal your money, fight for it. And we're, I think looking around the room and seeing everybody's heads and hearing the questions being asked, I think everybody sees the merits of the cash fund. And we just need to know who starts the fight and when you need reinforcements. So we'll do our best to see it through.
Appreciate your comments, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice job. Yeah, appreciate it very much. Thanks for being able to understand that in such a way that even I can understand it. So that's good. So.
Yes.
Right. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks again.
Take care.
Okay, wasn't sure if we're allowed to let ourselves. Thank you. Take care.
Oh, we had to unlock the door.
They're ready for us.
Yes.
So can you explain the cash fund to us now?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, yeah, we got a rock star committee right here. I can tell you that.
I want you to do it.
Yeah. We better take the
We're
we-
setting all of
we-
this. So,
we better take this offline.
You're getting paid for it, I want you
Which part?
to.
It's 4% off the top into a reserve. You know what, to me, it's a capital reserve fund like any municipality does for their equipment and buildings. We have a conservation reserve fund in Richmond. We take a little bit off the top of every budget year and it accumulates, and then a project comes along we want to do, and we vote to spend it
This
or
is an
not.
appropriation decision. It's gonna end up there.
Oh, yeah, it's all.
So let me
all
tell
over
you, we can do anything we want here, it's gonna, the final thing is gonna happen there. It's all there. It can change in 5 minutes. Okay,
Okay, on we go. Welcome, guys. Thank you. Sorry, we're a few minutes behind, but we had a lot of questions on the last subject. So you guys are in here to talk BGS property sales and process.
If you don't mind, may I preambilize?
Yes.
Only because I've had the pleasure of typing this request 3 biennium.
You know better than I do, okay?
So, the authority section of the capital bill is often the last section that anybody, and I'm Eric Philhorn from BGS, for the record, the last section that anybody looks at, because they're focused on the spreadsheet and they're going through the projects, and then we get to the end, and usually on the House side, it's like, oh, it's too late, we can't deal with that this year, come back, try next year, and Alice has even said, third time's a charm. And this is the third time where we have been kind of trapped in doing real estate transactions in a very, very archaic way. And Eric Pembroke can explain to you our most recent experience when we were trying to sell a property on Baldwin Street. So I leave it to Eric to
Still
take it from
trying.
there. Still trying.
Okay, so give us exactly what Mr. Phil Forstall, our preamble as far as what you're gonna tell us.
So I'm Eric Pembroke.
I think members association, anything related to?
Yes, uncle, yes, well, cousin, but always call him uncle.
Got it.
Yes, so absolutely, from that family,
Yeah.
if that or indifferent. So Eric Pembroke, Director of Planning and Property Management with BGS. Yes, here to talk more about selling state-owned property. Current, as Eric was talking about, 1416 Baldwin, just on the street. The current process to sell state-owned property, obviously, is we get permission from Senate to sell the property, legislature to sell the property, and then after that, we can advertise in 3 local papers. We can, so Mr. Ingles, you're from the real estate background,
Yes, I am.
I'm pretty sure that's probably not, pretty sure that's not how you sell commercial real estate, and in my experience, it's not how we sell commercial real
And
estate.
no offense to any newspaper and all of that, but I don't advertise in the newspaper for real estate.
So that's what we have to do. So we take out ads in newspapers this past, so 14 and 16, we advertised in local papers, like 7 days, the Times Argus, I think maybe in Burlington Free Press. We received 0 bids. We spent over a month advertising, and probably $2,500 to $3,000. So when that fails, then we can take the more traditional route to sell real estate. We could go and partner with a real estate firm or the brokerage firm. So we would love to propose skipping that first section to get to the way that normal commercial real estate is sold.
Papers are gone, newspapers are gone.
It was obviously written at a time when papers were more prevalent, and that's how we got it.
I used to sell 20 a day, and now we sell 0, I don't think, you know what I mean, where they're gone. It's sad, but that's the way, the only 7 days, that's the only, but people don't look at newspapers, as you know, they're in business, that's the last place they're gonna look for. It's gone.
They want, it's just, they want instant gratification. That's what they want. They want to be able to get there. They want to be sitting in their room. They want to click on it. They want to see it. And that's
Absolutely.
where it is.
That is where it is.
And so what needs to happen for us to get there? I mean, not saying that that's what the committee's decided to do, but what needs to happen, so the committee knows.
So we would obviously, we would need to rewrite how it's written today, the language to bypass that first section of posting in newspapers, posting in town halls, and leveraging a more traditional version of selling signal or selling property, commercial real estate. So
I just wanted to interject that in the back of your capital book is the proposed language, if you go to the authorities section. And also that we are not proposing to completely eliminate the other route in situations where that might make sense if we're dealing with a piece of property that has serious local interest.
yes.
We may be able to just go that way. And so key to the language is it says or,
Yes.
or we may go straight to a broker.
You pick what the situation is.
It gives
Yes.
us the.
Because exactly.
You're gonna sell cherry
So
street,
it's the
you're not
sale
using-
and then.
So this one right here, section 21, right?
Yeah, 21, there we go. So
Thank
for the
you.
commissioner is.
You see it, Brian?
Yeah, I can.
You were gonna sell cherry street, that's the last place.
So it's a statute.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm the one who types this stuff, so I remember where it is.
Big investment people would not look at the newspaper to find cherry street for sale. Check it.
Right.
No.
They've already read about it online.
Yeah,
Well,
In the
exactly,
newspaper
exactly.
online.
Or the, correct, or the newspaper online.
That's a no-brainer. to me.
There's also a chance that, there's an old parcel that we used to have a piece of equipment on years ago and it's off in, I don't know, Eden or something.
Population, 6 people
Yeah.
or something
Yeah.
like that, you want to do it locally, yeah. That's right. Now, that's, I don't know what language you need, but to me, this is a,
So getting rid of the paper, are you suggesting any other forms of advertising, or are you just doing away with?
No, I think in that, I think we say and or, so I think it's, we can still, depending on situation, go down that road with specific properties. But in conjunction with, instead of waiting for that to not produce.
Yeah.
We can
And
go,
how long is that wait, Eric?
so in this last one, we spent a month, well, we spent a month through the process by the time we advertised to get the sealed bids, to wait for sealed bids, so this was a month. We spent a month of time.
how do you pick a real estate agent? If you were gonna go to a real estate agent, what happens? How do you do that?
So we could do it, well, we already have a couple on state contract.
Okay.
So.
I hope, and I hope it would be in a process that, because I'm in real estate, and it's probably something that wouldn't be my forte of my company, and I would say that right out, but hey, listen, that's just not really what we do.
Yes.
Because even though I have the ability to do that, I would hope that would be with a firm that's what they do.
Exactly. So there's only, our state's only so large, there's only a few commercial
No, I'm just
brokers.
saying, what about the guy that says, well, I didn't get a chance to do it?
Right, well,
In
you're
the
gonna
state.
get that, right.
We're gonna
always
get,
one.
exactly, we're gonna get, yes.
Right.
But there's only a few commercial real estate brokerage firms in the state, Beach Commercial, and, why am I blanking on the name? No, we have Whitenburg. We actually have state contracts with them already.
Right.
Is there such a
To
thing as a
assist.
bidding process? Could they?
So they would bid on the percent, they would bid on the percent of which they would receive to broker the sale.
And they would tell what they would provide for services at that same time, or you outline what you provide.
So that's already outlined in our
Right.
contract.
Right.
But so for this 14-16, so now we can go, because we went through the process, so now we can go to these two organizations because we did not receive any bids. So under the guidance of the commissioner for the rule, we can go now to them. We are going to put a proposal out. You say, what is your fee? And what is your tech, how will you advertise? So that's what we will do with this particular.
Yeah, go ahead, you sure, both of you guys have questions, so we can see.
Yes.
And if they come in, both of them at 3%, 10%, or, I mean, how do you draw straws? I mean, they could certainly do that, right?
They absolutely could do that. That's a great question. I guess that's something I don't have the answer to sitting here.
It doesn't happen often then?
In my past experience, typically there's a 0.5%, there's a 1/4%, there's enough to make and actually one is stronger than the other. So Vermont, BT Commercial is probably one of the larger in Vermont to deal with commercial real estate. If you go to a national broker, they're gonna call BT Commercial to do your real estate in Vermont. Whitenburg, they're more into the analysis, so you would use them on maybe a different type of projects. So, but that could very well happen. Absolutely.
Sorry, Harrison,
Absolutely, there's a
question.
Yeah, but I didn't mean to cut you off. Are
No.
you good? So, so why do you have those contracts already? For what purpose did you go out to bid?
For those commercials, for those, so if you know, we use 108 Cherry Tree, if I wanted to do analysis on that particular location.
Oh, just for the
not to
research.
set-
you
Market
did.
analysis.
Exactly right.
Right, you do
Okay.
market analysis.
And I also leverage them now, if I need to go lease a location for branch X.
Okay,
And I have done what I can, I may go to them and say, hey, because they're having conversations behind the scenes that I can't have.
okay.
So that's why I have those contracts.
That makes sense. Side note, are those piggybackable by towns, by municipalities?
I know you need to municipalities have
Yes,
access to
yes,
those
because it'd be
contracts.
really helpful when the state
Oh.
goes out to bid, if municipalities could piggyback on those bids. So I'm just gonna ask that question periodically.
I know that a little more than half of the state contracts that we hold are accessible by municipalities. I'm not sure about
I know
the
the answer to
Oh,
this
you
one.
do know the
I
answer.
know
to
the
this one. I
Cool.
bet you're
No, this was set up for BGS's use only.
Oh, okay, all right, so
So-
in the future, maybe consider that.
Absolutely. No,
So-
because I was asked that by somebody else and.
Well, now you know there's a need.
I don't know.
So, are there any other folks, I think you said there's only two, but are there any others who, since now the scope hasn't been enlarged, who you should, meaning that you should go out to bid again, so
I
that
mean,
everybody has a fair.
Should we make these changes? That may be something that we absolutely should look at doing. It's
Okay.
putting the RFP back out to encompass more of the state.
Okay.
Others. Yep, absolutely.
And then in residential contracts, sometimes if it's a very high price, when you're dealing with millions of dollars, it's not 7%, it's a lower percentage.
Yes, exactly right.
Because
And that's
the
where the
cost
bid
of
process
providing the
will come in.
service isn't,
Right.
20 times what it is.
Correct.
So is that the case in commercial also?
Commercial, yes, yep.
And they're gonna ask him to bid, they're gonna ask him to tell what your fee. is.
Exactly.
They're gonna,
Right, but the
So
fee
they have a
would be
range.
per value.
no, well,
No?
It'll be
It's
per,
just a
it'll
flat
be, it'll be per, it'll be
the
per
percentage,
sale. And
the percentage, they're gonna ask them to bid, I apologize.
no, you,
They're gonna ask them to bid on the percentage of what they're gonna charge.
Exactly
For
right.
whatever the property
Right.
sells for. So they're gonna ask them to bid against each other, so it might not be, so hey,
Oh, each
the standard
property
rate might
you're
be
gonna
10,
do that.
yeah, the standard rate might be 10, but what would you do it for?
exactly
Okay,
right.
So each
So-
property you'll.
Exactly right.
All right.
Because you may have a property that's
Yeah, yeah.
$10 million and they're gonna charge you 2%, and the $300,000 property, they're gonna charge you 6%.
And then we have expertise in different types
So-
of properties too.
Exactly right.
Okay, cool. So, on a different topic, the state owns a lot of property.
Yes.
We've been hearing about properties proposed to be sold. Some properties may be really good potential sites for other uses like housing that other parts of the state might be interested in. Have you thought about, or can your process include opportunity for other folks or other entities of the state to pay you, pay the fair market value, but not have to pay
Go ahead.
you're trying to, it should be a win-win for both.
Mhm.
So that the buyer doesn't have to pay the excess and the seller doesn't have to
Mhm.
pay. So you basically get the banks out of it, and allow either another entity of the state or perhaps the municipality to be able to, make use of that public property in another public way.
Eric, go ahead.
A couple of, I thought I knew where you were going and then you went
Yeah.
someplace else that was similar to where I was going, but there are statutory requirements for how we do beyond marketing. This is really a conversation about marketing the properties, but in terms of when we sell, we're required to get fair market value.
Yes.
The commissioner is required to offer the property to other state entities for consideration for use before we come to you to sell.
Oh, great.
So, if we're coming to sell you a piece or ask permission to sell a piece of property, It's because we've already said, okay, does corrections need this for anything? Does, we run through the list of agencies and departments. We don't necessarily, go to the municipality and try to do a deal with them first, but there are situations like in Waterbury where the municipality is interested in housing, and they're talking about potentially subdividing a piece of the Waterbury complex. A deal like that, we have to play it straight. We have to go fair market value, we have to make it available to everybody, but the legislature can always not withstand statute and say, thou shalt make a deal with Waterbury. So that kind of thing really comes from you guys. But we're still, no, I mean, this is a rare occurrence. It's ridiculous that we have 2 in 1 year. So often 0, sometimes 1. 2 is a lot of transactions for a year.
I'm not at all suggesting that they would get a deal and have to pay less than fair market value.
Right.
But it could be beneficial so that the public doesn't have to pay the transactional fees. That's what I'm going at.
And we don't
It's
have
something
to,
where the,
exactly, we do not have to use a broker. If an instance like that happened, and we had that connectivity,
yeah,
the only reason I would go to a broker is if, just like 1460, I've tried to move this property. I had no success doing it our traditional way. No one else was interested in it. Now I'm gonna go to that next step. So in that instance, absolutely, that
Okay,
fee could be
well,
eliminated.
I don't know how it works I'm gonna try to put a little clarity to it. Maybe you guys can jump in on it. I know how it works in the private market as far as where it is. It actually, no matter what you get for bids at the end of the day, it's still the seller who can choose which option that they choose. And so if you have something, Senator Harrison, like what you're talking about, and you have an entity and they wish to be, they wish to be there, at the end of the day, again, understanding that the state wants to get fair market value, they want to get the state the best money's worth back, they would probably still, unless statute said differently, they would still have the right to say, no, we want to go with XYZ over there because we think it fits our model at the end of the day. And so it's not something that you have to write legislation for. It's already, the fair market value part of it works. Again, the only part that I don't know about, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn about it, is the statute of what's been already said. How you're gonna do that.
that's great to hear. So just heads up, Montpelier might be interested in the properties around here.
And they'll have every opportunity to bid on it.
Okay, I didn't know that they would.
Absolutely.
The way I
Absolutely.
understood it before was that they wouldn't.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm surprised they didn't respond. We probably put it on the bulletin board in the town office,
Yeah, we-
right?
There you go.
Exactly right.
Maybe they didn't see
They didn't
it.
see it, because no one
Now
knows
we're-
they walked by the
Now
bulletin.
we're gonna put it something wild here, so.
All right, good.
So if this is something that we said, okay, we want to do that, what was our process? What do we do?
Well, best case scenario is that it will come down from House corrections in the capital bill.
Okay.
And now you'll know what it means when it lands on your
Okay.
desk. And if
Sure.
it doesn't, then maybe there would be a conversation.
They're interested in pursuing it.
Do I think they're interested? We started with you because they're busy with other stuff this week. So, I mean, we've talked about it and, I mean.
It's a no-brainer.
You said third time's a charm.
All
we're trying to do is
third time's a
modernize.
charm.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, there's nothing, I don't know, I don't think there's
So
anything.
if we don't see this when, if we don't see this and when it comes over, this is what we can put in. And then if they don't agree or whatever, we go to their conference and whatever, and we'll figure it out. But to me, just speaking out loud, not trying to tell you, it
Yes.
makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, so it's just modernizing a process that was done
Perfectly said.
Every now and then.
Modernize it.
Yeah,
20 years ago. So that's all.
Yeah.
Right.
And, every time this has come through before, it's because it's in the back of the book. I think by the time it comes up, everyone's like, but we're on deadline, we can't deal with this. So we just wanted to shine light
Our
early.
newspaper has changed over the last few years. and
Yep.
Newspapers are going right here, and that's what it is. It's not a secret. Like I said, I used to sell 80 free presses on a Sunday. If I sell 6, I'm doing good.
Wow. No kidding.
Number one, they're overpriced, $4.50. There's no news in it because it's all news that you saw a week ago.
Right.
No local news anymore because they don't have reporters.
Mhm.
It's great, it's, Rutland Herald's still pretty good. but most of them are gone. Our local paper's gone, requesting. I don't know why they're still in business, but New York Times still, ships them in, but that's a mistake. New York Times is still New York Times.
Even that one's a little skinnier now.
Right, newspaper people don't, they're all online.
Yeah.
Because a New York Times costs you $7 now on Sunday. And,
Wow.
that's a lot of money.
Tracking.
Yeah. So I can tell you from experience, the days of newspaper are gone. Yeah, right, exactly. Used to look at the lawn ads, you've got the page after page
Right.
of cars and jobs. You open the free press now, you probably got 2 items, that's it.
And one was my posting.
Yeah,
It's real prominent
So
now.
it is, but it's not working. So
So good, what else?
that's all I
That's
have.
where I start to get into trouble when you do that.
Right, exactly. That's when I leave.
That's all we came with today.
I like when you go off on the reservation. I like that.
We worry about you when we have
Yeah.
anything else.
Yeah.
You buy your wife something nice today?
I got her some nice truffles.
Ooh, wow.
The kind you like?
The kind.
Because there's why is there a bite out of every one of them?
Right.
I want to make sure you like them.
I must confess that I got her enough so that she could share, and I did get some that my son likes too, because.
Good for you.
Not completely selfish.
Wow.
Well, we thank you for that, and we'll keep watch for it.
And I presume you know that there's a birthday upstairs as well, right?
Perfect.
Your counterpart, Senator Engels.
Oh, I heard about it.
People have been sending things up there all day long.
Valentine's birthday.
There was a musical performance.
Oh, I heard about it.
Oh,
Yeah.
so
Wow.
I didn't know
I
that.
don't know. I think the cake's gonna drop any minute.
Okay.
Oh, so we should just.
Yeah, now's the time to go.
Huh? All
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Good to
well,
know.
I'll have to go up there.
That's all right.
We finished our work early, so that's.
I know.